see. It was an interesting time. I'm still preparing. He's busy working.
In the light.
Second row.
Yeah. Yeah, I gotta give my hard time. They call this the academic building. Every other building on campus is a non-academic building.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, I'm sorry. She asked me about yeah. You'll be obviously. Well, actually, this is one time. Oh, I love it.
Yeah. So this was mic check. 1, 2, 3. Check, check, check. Mic check. 1, 2, 3. Test. 1, 2, 3.
This is they asked to go back over I'll make sure. It goes to the no. I got it. That'll be great. Ain't that something?
Talking to the back of the room. Okay, so I made these notes for you. Again, I'm happy to
These scores are bad though, the reply.
These I just do what short things like this. So this, if you had said, don't let me introduce it, Jennifer,
No, it's your preference. I mean, this is something you're doing your own notes. Yeah,
you've written your own notes.
no, I have them printed. So do you want?
I'll leave this here.
Okay.
Because you're going to moderate from here.
Yeah, so we've got so each 5 minutes where we talk about this. And so do you want?
So she'll speak for 30 years. She wants to speak for 30 years. They will sit. No, they will come up after she's done.
Okay.
She's going to speak from here. It's being they will come up after she talks, and she will sit here.
So you will.
I will leave this.
So I'll let you.
I'll leave sure.
Okay, I'll just stay over here. Perfect.
So this is one. Yeah, she did that. We can actually check in and see how it's going. Perfect. That should do that. If you could do that, I'd really be great. You've already got making notes.
Maybe like 4 or 6 people watching.
2 or 3. Okay.
Ready? Want to start?
Yeah, get started. Welcome everybody. My name is Ian Stewart. I'm a professor here at the University of King's College, History of Science and Technology program in the foundation year program. my great pleasure to invite you all to this event, this talk, and this panel discussion that will follow. I'd like to thank the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council for essentially funding the Social Sciences and Humanities Ocean Research and Education Network, which is a Dalhousie Memorial University and University of King's College network of scholars who study oceans, think about oceans, write about oceans in collaboration with scientists and by themselves. So today's talk is sponsored by those folks. We're joined by the Environmental Information Use and Influence Research Group at Dalhousie University. This event is also sponsored by the University of King College, the History of Science and Technology program, and also the Ecology Action Center based here in Halifax. The event is being broadcast live on Facebook, so hello Facebook world. And you will have sound, but you won't be able to, I'm afraid, type in questions of that kind. The event today will feature Dr. Telesca, whom I'll introduce in a moment, which will be followed by a panel discussion. So Dr. Telesca will speak for about 30 minutes, and then there will be a 15-minute opportunity for 3 panelists to speak for 5 minutes each. Dr. Telesca will respond for about 10 minutes, not too much more, which should take us to 3 o'clock, and then we'll open up the floor for conversation for Q&A, and hopefully end at 3:20. Some folks have things to go to at 3:30. People should feel free, obviously, to leave as they need to. I don't think I've left anything out. Have I forgotten to thank anyone? I'm not sure. I don't think so. So let me quickly then just introduce. Oh, of course, and the panel itself will be moderated by Dr. Jerry Bannister, a professor of history with expertise in oceans history and Atlantic Canadian history from the Dalhousie History Department. Dr. Telesca has her PhD in Media, Culture and Communication from New York University in 2014, with a BA at the University of Richmond in history. She's worked in the fields of women's studies, University of Connecticut, and has a double MA in anthropology and law and society, one at the University of Connecticut and the second in law and society at New York University. Her talk today, Accounting for Loss in Fish Stocks, A Word on Life as Biological Asset, is based off her paper published in 2017 in the journal Environment and Society Advances in Research. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jennifer Telesca.
Thank you all for coming today, and certainly to reiterate the long list of sponsors of this event. So to the title of the talk, keywords are important, as the cultural theorist Raymond Williams made clear long ago. In the world of marine conservation, there is no keyword more important than a fish stock, commonplace, taken for granted, repeated without end. This talk asks, what does stock as a native category, what anthropologists would call a native category, reveal about the dominant commitments to non-human beings in society today? If experts have at their disposal sophisticated techniques to count sea creatures, then why have many fish stocks still crashed? Of the 60 meanings of stock recorded in Oxford English Dictionary, this talk foregrounds 2. Stock as asset, inventory, or capital equivalent to an investment in a portfolio of bonds, cash, maybe gold, and stock as population, race, or progenitor of a people, reflected in the phrase marries of good stock. To be clear, these 2 meanings mutually reinforce one another. They cannot be divorced from one another, at least that's part of my title claim. Regarding the first, stock as asset. As early as 1350, the stocks or stocks market was the name given to an arcade for fish, meat, and other traded goods in the city of London. From their earliest days, fish markets were spatially linked to the growth and development of modern securities. That fish in open water could be secured as stock at all found its roots in capital exchange, long a sovereign concern. Similar to land-based forms of livestock, first documented in 1687 in the Oxford English Dictionary, as those domesticated animals kept on a farm for use or profit, but a stock in fish as a group of creatures in the wild signals an important shift toward capital accumulation. In this formulation, a stock is akin to capital supply, to inventory for profit maximization, and therefore critical to a nation-state's economic growth and aspirations for empire through control over commodities at sea. Even so, a stock in fish is never just economy all the way down. This brings me to stock's other important formulation, stock as population. Not until 1898, after years of flux and herring, did the German scientist Friedrich Heinke introduce the stock concept as a biological referent corresponding to what is presently called a species, as well as units within a species that are a race, a population, or subpopulation. A scientific vocabulary for fish as stock presupposed their very measurement. Similar to the administrative practice of fixing and making permanent surnames for tax collection, the conscription of soldiers, the tracking of property, a relatively recent historical phenomenon, the naming of fish according to stock, while clarifying for scientific experts, made possible the animal's very commodification. To standardize, make commensurable, and render abstract a living being, whether slave or non-human animal, required the assistance of masters of reckoning or those experts that could smooth over obstacles in transactions as large-scale trading networks expanded and capitalism grew. Remarkable then that fish worldwide have plummeted in size and number since Heinke advanced more than a century ago the stock concept. How do we better understand this development? To awaken oneself to the language of a fish stock, I would like to reconstruct the historical developments that on the quiet have monetized fish within the very institutions intended to protect them, but have not. I dialogue in the main with Mary Poovey, Theodore Porter, and James Scott. For the purposes of this talk, I want to address the history of quantification as it bears on an emerging administrative state beginning as long ago as 15th century Europe. Quantification was the means by which a small class of experts in due course came to assert authority over natural and social worlds by managing wealth and society, or what I'm calling here assets and populations. An important undercurrent of this literature is the preoccupation with channeling uncertainty through the machinery of risk, measured in statistics, probabilities, models, and metrics. The historical legacies informing why policymakers recruit scientific management to assert their authority on stocks is at issue. This talk makes this argument. Over time, fisheries managers have come to employ as their foremost tool of authority statistical measures that model the radical uncertainty of a future biological asset, rendering the object of marine conservation not the fish as a living being, but as a stock. Through the verbiage of a fish stock, we come to know how the life of a sea creature is reconfigured as biowealth at the joint of both asset and population, which enables extractive capitalism to keep the productive power of nature off the balance sheet. This is what Jason Moore in his recent book would call cheap nature. An important corollary to this argument is that acquiescence to the exterminatory logic of a fish stock depends on an alienated citizenry, amongst ourselves, of implicitly internalizing value commoditized in the extreme, so that the flesh of fish and the ocean that gives it life have become just another item for sale for the vast majority of people. The universal adoption of this discourse in the press, in policy circles, in marine advocacy campaigns suggests that even the most conservation-minded do not fully realize what the word stock in practice commits them to. I turn to the history of quantification to appreciate the mercantilist concern with national wealth as it corresponds with the need for figures, with numbers about foreign and domestic trade, read stock as asset. The history of quantification also tells us something important about the sovereign preoccupation with fertility, mortality, literacy, and the like registered in numbers about society, read stock as population. It is worth differentiating between numbers of fact and probability, as the philosopher Ian Hacking does, understanding probabilities as model tendencies that forecast what may be, for the policymaker to decide what should be done. Here, I examine what Puvi calls the modern fact as building block, as that tiny particle of information, the capsule, the nugget, something compact, robust, down-to-earth, neutral, bite-sized, the very opposite of theory, conjecture, hypothesis, generalization. To transform fish into stock as both asset and population, I dig deep in centuries past to find the prototype for contemporary metrics in the elementary practice of double-entry bookkeeping, first formulated in the late 1400s. Details about financial transactions in which each entry in a ledger satisfied an equation of equal and opposite corresponding effects, of assets and liabilities balanced in the black or red of equity, demonstrated to the magistrates how the specialized experience of the mercantilist could be elevated to the status of expertise. Such prominent theorists as Max Weber have noted that double-entry bookkeeping is closely linked to the emergence of rational capitalism. The double-entry book took the unwieldy mass of cluttered prose about trade and simplified it through the abstract, cool idiom of number. How to deploy metrics presented the magistrate with more than just an administrative headache. It revealed a vital aspect of state security tied to the concern of governing wealth and society, or assets and populations. It should not be lost on the audience that the double-entry book is foundation to the utilitarian calculus of cost-benefit analysis, so favored by policymakers today at a time of neoliberalism. Puvi finds that over time, numbers attained an aura of authority in the modern era as they circulated in networks of hierarchy and exchange, buoyed by the growing cultural investment in mathematics and the influence of key figures in natural philosophy such as Francis Bacon. The aim, ground knowledge on empirical fact rather than on universal or metaphysical essences, which were once the corner of ancient knowledge. Puvi writes, far from arguing that the human senses were too frail to produce knowledge about the world, the double-entry system confidently showed how such knowledge could be created. Human exceptionalism paced on a Haraway was in train. A prominent English merchant and mercantilist could thus proclaim accounting a science in 1623, that is, a way to visualize what had previously been hidden. With double-entry bookkeeping, the merchant had the device to manage transactions concerning wealth and society for the sovereign, to discover an unknown nation through the description of its particulars made possible a science of wealth and society, which underwrote the monarch's greatness by giving him a synoptic view for policy formation. Data about who the king ruled, where he ruled, what he ruled, in accordance with numbers on domestic production, disease, Bible-reading publics, structured his faculty of cultivating strength in nation. Required were not collective witnessing or anecdotal narratives, but rather the precision of number. It is remarkable that numbers until the late 16th century carried a pejorative connotation, once associated with black magic. How times have changed. Over time, numbers as a representational type came to signify the impersonal, the impartial, the rational, the objective, a form free of influence, author, interest, language barriers, and the accompanying problems of translation. As a technology of trust, numbers base their authority in the anonymous, the institutional, rather than in the personal and the divine. In the newfound rhetoric of the secular, metrics ensured rulers of their dominion and convinced taxpayers to ante up. In this formulation, trust in numbers is a consequence not of mathematics per se, but of the drive toward democratic government by way of its administration. In double entry accounting, to be precise meant the expert had to be consistent, not accurate or exact. Mechanical objectivity, to use Porter's phrase, implies then and now that accuracy has no meaning if the procedure cannot be performed elsewhere by strangers in the scientific community. Similar to the mathematical model discussed shortly, double entry bookkeeping prioritizes expertise as orderly, methodical, objective, grounded in specific techniques, sanctioned by a body of specialists, allowing judgment to seemingly disappear, just the facts, as it were. The actual writer of mathematical fact became invisible, nameless, effaced, since objectivity implied not truth, but impersonality. Today's technoscientists assessing fish stocks are heir to this double-entry system of centuries past. What is now known as statistics or fact of state did not emerge as a category of knowledge until the early 19th century, even though numbers long played a central role in preparing public administrators for duty. Yet the experts who built the regulatory state did not merely ready numbers or observe and map a reality already born of the heavens. They made the reality they described by using metrics to manage it, to control it, to solve problems associated with it as a population, space, or non-human nature under their jurisdiction. Neat mathematical arrangements eased how the experts engineered control over the wayward, including itinerant sea creatures. Modeling probabilities, similar in effect to the creation of the rudimentary modern fact in double-entry bookkeeping, has become a treasured device for the experts managing fish today. I now turn to modeling as a technique that takes non-human nature into account by aggregating what statisticians call a population, or a conceptual unit that marks a collective by imposing order over heterogeneous material. Consider that this approach aligns with what Raymond Williams calls the making of a singular and essential nature with consistent and reconcilable laws, which writes out an awful lot of history and obscures the assumptions that underpin the dominant interpretations of experience in society. To understand modeling practices, I turn to the problem of uncertainty, which no ruler, no ruling class, no double-entry book, no model can ever fully eradicate. To understand the role of uncertainty in the bureaucratic penchant for number, the economist Frank Knight is a guide on important distinction between risk and uncertainty. For Knight, uncertainty signifies unknown outcomes that cannot be quantified and thus cannot be modeled. By contrast, risk implies data that can be quantified for the purpose of modeling futures. The statistical analysts in the specialization of fish population dynamics measure risk by approximation and ask, say, how many swordfish nation-states may catch this year so that the model may forecast how many swordfish they should catch in years to come. To get the answer, the mathematical experts modeled animals' growth, birth, and mortality rates, but cannot account for such uncertainties as ocean acidification and the fluctuation in ocean temperature, which significantly impact the reproductive capacity of fish. Notice the bridge between is, what information is known by approximation, and ought, what fisheries policy should be. Modeling helps policymakers see a stock not yet visible so that it performs as it should. As the modelers make the leap from the space of probability, quantifiable, in the space of uncertainty, unquantifiable, what is possible inside these bureaucratic zones opens the door to elaborating the probabilistic schemes, distortions, and projections that carry the weight of government authority and mathematical expertise. Even so, modeling outcomes may appear quite independent of the actual state of marine life or the ocean's impaired reproductive capacities. A simulation that models the stock of Atlantic bluefin tuna can be mathematically correct and statistically defensible, but far from the reality it forecasts, a phenomenon that I have observed ethnographically. Concern about the modern fact illustrated how experts measured relative frequencies under different conditions and events in the past or present, such as suicide. By contrast, sophisticated mathematical models produce probabilities that express how confident one is in a future that, by definition, is unknown. Models are at once proximate to the phenomenon they seek to simulate, just as they operate at a distance from it. Similar to the double-entry book, the model as instrument simplifies, abstracts, makes impersonal its author, and generates outcomes that are precise rather than accurate. It looks forward, not backward, unable to reconstruct history. Instead, it takes a present situation to predict an outcome based on a plausible, if oversimplified, scenario. When considering stock as population and asset, the models used to measure its volatility must be seen simultaneously as an effort to manage the threat of lost fish for society and to exploit that risk for wealth. Experts deploy probabilities as mathematical evidence to control uncertainty through the apparatus of risk when making decisions about the future, all in a bid to perform how rational the enlightened man is under secular rule. The scientists who work with mathematical models in fisheries worry most about stock as population rather than as asset, at least in principle. To appreciate why population is an important category of technocratic rule, I reference what Michel Foucault calls in disparate texts biopower, or the forms of power exercised over living beings as populations to secure their very management. Biopower developed once the sovereign took hygiene, sexuality, nutrition, and other matters of the body for challenges to his order by the end of the 18th century. A biopolitical framework offers this discussion clarity on its logic of technique. Intervention operates at the level of the aggregate population, not at the level of the individual being, since what can be assessed, measured, and rendered predictable for its optimization are detailed statistical accounts of the whole. Notice how population flattens the complexity of living beings. When biopower is leveraged in animal studies, the point is to render status of populations a constant negotiation amongst experts preoccupied with biological in the exercise of power. This mode of governing makes possible the disturbing politics that designate populations' biological substrate, that is, by race. For Foucault, the division of humans by race was a basis mechanism for modern state power, since the state promoted some, but not all lives in the old sovereign right to kill. Proximate reasoning applies in the world of fisheries, since exploited animals are often apprehended as a self-sustaining group of abstract beings that persist in geographic areas over ecological time. The German scientist Heinke, credited with transforming fish into stock, developed what he called different races of herrings with the aim of bringing landings into line through regulation. The geographer Dean Bavington writes, quote, Heinke borrowed the population concept from human demography to develop a powerful quantitative methodology to distinguish aggregations or stocks of wild fish, unquote. Heinke assumed that if a population is normally distributed, that it must be a pure race, that is, genetically homogeneous. In developing a rudimentary kind of multivariate statistics, Heinke calculated the range of the normal by adapting methods from the dark days of anthropology when the study of biological characteristics justified the shaming of undesirables of people in society. Heinke relied on no less of an authority than Carl Pearson, the founder of the discipline of mathematical statistics, the well-known proponent of eugenics, the one who in influential paper from 1894 argued for separate races of crabs based on shell length. Historical research on understanding these entanglements is needed and may prove profoundly at odds with the stories told about the birth of fisheries science and its esteemed forebears. Even so, It is clear that numbers are never as value-free as their champions persist in imagining, even in the pursuit of theoretical rather than applied science. For a population to be alleged an asset fit for trade, early mathematical statisticians manufactured fixed by their aggregate according to the abstraction of race. We can thus not divorce stock as asset from stock as population. Consider the methods of scientific management adopted on the plantation, which rendered slaves not as individuals, but as abstract, commoditized units of labor, many of which could be combined to make a whole. A recent book by Sven Beckert, some of you may be familiar with, called Slavery's Capitalism, details some of this material. The logic to render a living being for market, a stock had to be invented and fish reduced to a singular abstract class of being, contained, ordered, measured, quantified, and commensurable based on available taxonomies which statisticians found in the eugenics movement. Similar to the emergence of scientific forestry, fisheries science over the years devised techniques that enhance the legibility of non-human nature to policymakers by making convenient a standardized commodity for market, done not to describe an ecological system already made, but to create it through methods that give the category stock the force of law. Think of the UN Fish Stocks Agreement, for example. The carnage in fish post-World War II happened despite or because of the clever new mathematical models charged with managing uncertainty by quantifying risk under the rationale that they maximize profit from commodified living beings, stock by stock. By the middle of the 20th century, fish population dynamics was at the forefront of economic biology with its use of statistical methods, mathematical modeling, and life table analyses. Its models aim to create a plausible, if oversimplified, real-world scenario about the future of a fish stock. The masculinist practice of imposing universal mathematical truths on non-human nature implied that this expertise minimized history, since what was favored was not the particular, not the individual, not the erratic, but rather the harmonious, unified whole of a population in equilibrium. Uncertain ecological factors, such as how a species interacts with another, are outside the forecasting models, as are change in regulation and state subsidies, which affect how hard a country fishes. The great simplification of the ocean into a machine with cogs of isolated fish was necessary for population dynamics to become a rigorous technical discipline. Yet it severely bracketed or assumed to be constant a complex set of relations between species and how humans interacted with them, compartmentalizing poorly understood creatures one by one so that they could be rendered a single element of instrumental value. That modeling fish has intensified as the industry has privatized is not coincidental. Modeling is the instrument capable of rationalizing the inventory of fish as a commodified being, allowing well-financed commercial fishers to better compete under conditions of growing economic concentration. The less the overseer is trusted to save the fish, since past acts have shown it, over time, to have abetted stock collapse, the greater the appeal to numerical forms of knowledge production to justify the overseer's survival. Metrics have become instruments of rule because, in principle, they lower the temperature of debate in marine policy. The managerial discourse of best practices implies that mathematical evidence sanctioned by scientific protocol is necessary to bolster a position, since the divine no longer can live in the secular age. The reason is not only to protect against fraud in science, but also to ensure that moneyed interests cannot be distinguished in policymaking. To be clear, fisheries science is not the problem. The lesson is not that population dynamics should be dissolved or acquitted, or that a better model with better data, using better computer technology with better defined parameters will solve the overfishing problem. that data can be fine-tuned and made ever more precise is a myth that endures in fisheries science today. This rationale corresponds with the assumption that overfishing is only a technical problem that the state can solve by deciding when and how forcefully to regulate based on the mathematical evidence of so-called neutral experts in fisheries science. It evacuates the politics that inform why modeling exists in the first place. I've learned in conversations with fisheries scientists to be clear. The point is not to engage in formal linguistic gymnastics or to replace one term for another. Harm is constituted elsewhere. The logic of extractive capitalism renders biological beings, slave and animal, chattel and beast, into populations capable of being ledgered as assets appropriate for absolute possession and therefore for trade. To be managed, sea creatures first had to be devalued as life, rendered an animal endowed only with instincts, defecating, hunting, making little babies if they can still find a mate. Their biology, captured by extractive capitalism, reduces them to their profitable reproducibility as monetized, exploitable assets for market. That is why they are tallied, inventoried, and treated as stock. The effort to classify, rank, order, and contain living beings on the rungs of social hierarchy represents a mode of relating to others seen in domains well beyond marine conservation. This rationale animated the fever to define the animal kingdom in its taxonomical splendor, brilliantly detailed by Harriet Ritvo, and the geographer's effort to name and categorize the continents with Europe at their center. The administrative state took classification to another level when its functionaries quantified non-human animals according to the cold metrics of number, making the expert of necessity at least one step, often several steps, removed from the population they governed. The problem of alienation, then, is not only economic, it is also social and cultural. Etymologies are more than mere curiosities. This analysis is an attempt to get the word out about the need for a critical vocabulary that challenges not only grandiose ideas like the Anthropocene and the tragedy of the commons, but also their parts. What about other keywords that saturate discourse in the circles of marine conservation, the ones that treat fish as resources plugged into and benefiting ecosystem services like cogs in a fantastical machine? The task is to reflect on the possible harms embedded in the verbiage structuring these totalizing ideas, even if using them for what are critical and reformist, even transformative purposes. The stakes could not be greater as the sixth mass extinction looms over the human imagination. Thank you.
So the first thing I want to do is to make sure I thank Dr. Ian Stewart for organizing both today's panel events and the other events this week. We really appreciate all the work you put into it. So the way in which we're going to structure the rest of this afternoon, thank you everyone for coming out this afternoon, is we're going to have three panels speaking for 5 minutes each, and we're going to give Dr. Telesca a chance to respond for about 5 or 10 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for a group discussion. So our first panelist, our first speaker, is Laurenne Schiller, an IDPhD student here at Dalhousie University, working with Megan Bailey, Dr. Megan Bailey in the Marine Affairs Program. After her, we have Dr. Susanna Fuller, the Marine Conservation Coordinator with the Ecology Action Center. And then finally, we have Ian Stewart, Dr. Ian Stewart, historian here at the Science and Technology Program, and the first year, the FIT program here at the University of King's College. And Ian has kindly agreed to replace Dean Bavington, who wanted to be here and unfortunately was unable to be here this afternoon. So I'm going to hand it over to our first panelist.
Appreciate you want to get all three of them.
That would be great. Yeah, if you're willing, that'd be nice to have everyone.
Yeah, sit. Yeah.
Susanna, right there. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you, Jen, for sharing your research and perspective as a fisheries scientist who also loves etymology. I enjoyed your review on the origins, context, and applications of the term stock. I agree much can be learned from how and why we use the words that we do, often colloquially without considering their roots or connotations. When it comes to our perceptions of and our interactions with nature, I agree that particular care and lexicon is warranted. That said, I found the main thesis of your paper, that viewing fish as biowealth by using the term stock has contributed to the significant decline in populations over the last century, a substantial leap between theory and reality. I believe this perspective fails to account for numerous underlying biological, social, and cultural circumstances that have contributed to depletion in different parts of the world, including the life history attributes of many commonly overfished species, breakdowns in both access and tenure in coastal fishing communities, and abuses of fundamental human rights and fishing practices. I worry you present a classic case of correlation versus causation, and I'll briefly touch on my three main concerns with the arguments you've presented. My first thought in reading your paper was that the issues of overfishing and fishing down occur globally, including in countries where English is not spoken and the local term for a population of fish is not synonymous with the economic context of stock as you described. For this reason, I thought your paper was highly Anglo-centric, and the conclusions you draw are based on terminology that is only applicable to a fraction of fishing countries and people. For example, you reference the depletion of Atlantic bluefin tuna, yet you do not discuss the similar depletion of Pacific bluefin, a species that has been fished almost exclusively by Japanese artisanal and industrial fleets over the last century, well before formal RFMO stock assessments for this species existed. The two characters for a fish population in Japanese are kai and gun, which translate to system and cluster, as in a group of similar entities like stars in the solar system. Thus, this term has no relation to monetary profit. While I agree we're experiencing a loss of biodiversity on Earth that some have dubbed the sixth mass extinction, I do caution against including the decline seen in other groups of wildlife in your argument around stock, as these losses are often attributable to other anthropogenic factors, the most pervasive of all being climate change. Urban development and a commercial demand for timber has resulted in massive global deforestation and put many species of trees on the IUCN Red List of threatened species. Yet in forestry, a large grove of commercially exploited trees is known as a stand. Similarly, as history has shown, many of the terrestrial mammalian species that humans have hunted to or near extinction are not defined as stocks, yet we have still found value and economic incentive in their tusks, skins, and meat, and killed them regardless of the terminology used to define their populations. Secondly, for a paper that positions itself as an interdisciplinary literature review of the word stock in marine conservation and heavily criticizes the violence of language used by scientists, you did not analyze or reference the terminology included in any actual fishery stock assessments. Your paper has 74 references, of which only 6 are from natural science-focused journals, and many of these references to fisheries research are more than 2 decades old. Further, while you include references on economics from a social science perspective and present many of your own ideas on the monetary valuation of fish, no papers by fisheries economists are cited, which suggests a serious omission of the seminal work by Gordon Munro and Colin Clark in 1979 regarding natural capital, and many publications since by these authors and others. A paper published in May 2016 by Trevor Branch and Alison Linnell looked at the top 199 cited fisheries papers up to 2014. Their list was also Anglo-centric, yet of the paper titles in their list, the term stock features only 4 times. For comparison, the term population is in 15 titles, the words fish or fishes in 78. Other words including ecosystem, effects, salmon, and species were all more common than the term stock, as was the term conservation. Lastly, although many populations of fish and invertebrates have been overfished, the presence of stock assessments has enabled managers, in some places, to curtail effort and allow for modest recovery. When the United States updated its Magnuson-Stevens Act in 2006, it included text that required all commercially caught species to have a stock assessment so that domestic management strategies could be based on the outcomes of these assessments to either rebuild or sustainably manage the fish and invertebrates in American waters. Of course, the presence alone of a stock assessment does not mean proper action will be taken to mitigate against depletion or allow for recovery. Conflicts in management exist for numerous social, political, and economic reasons, some of which you discussed today and in your talk yesterday. But ultimately, I believe that if everyone in the room starts with the same baseline understanding of where a fish population is at, in this case through a stock assessment, then the burden of conservation falls on those in charge of delineating adequate policies to regulate fishing rather than on the words we use to define it. Thanks.
Oh, no response? Oh, all right. I'll wait till the end. Okay. So my critique, I think, is, well, responds a little bit more from a practical perspective. Number one, I don't think I disagree that referring to a wild population source as a stock, I think it is problematic to some extent. But as Laurenne said, that's not, a lot of fisheries scientists don't always use stock. Stock assessment is often done in a very management-specific context. And a few years ago, I gave a walrus talk where I talked about how we needed to decommodify how we talk about fish and stop talking about it as food, and stop talking about it as a stock, but as a population, and consider it as food. And maybe if we considered it as food, as a public, we would care about it a little bit more. I think one of the things that I take a little bit of issue with is that it is the object of marine conservation. And for me, I see marine conservation and its partner, often including in international law and policy, is sustainable use. And I think this is where the the issue of referring to fish as a stock, and scientists and managers who are tasked to managing the sustainable use are actually not tasked with managing conservation. They're managing sustainable use, and I think that is a really it's an important point in this paper, because the paper argues that using stock means that we're not going to do marine conservation. I have been in many fisheries management meetings and RFMO meetings where the object is actually not conservation; it is sustainable use. I would, and to this end, like when we think of how we think of terrestrial species and their populations, we still do deplete them significantly, whether or not they're a stock or a population. I think the difference is we can still have active fisheries for endangered species. We have those right now in Atlantic Canada, Atlantic cod and tuna as big iconic examples, considered endangered from a population perspective, but we continue to have active fisheries on them. So whether they're a stock or a population is still problematic that we're fishing endangered species. I think the other points that aren't really covered in this paper, and I think it's a good point of discussion, but the idea of precautionary approach and ecosystem approach, those were, in my mind and my understanding, were management principles. They were things that humans, were supposed to take into consideration when making management decisions when faced with scientific information such as stock assessments. And what I've tended to see instead is that the precaution is downloaded to scientists. We've asked scientists to give us reference points and MSY-based reference points, and then bring back the uncertainty so the managers can make a decision. But it really downloads that idea of precaution, that you are careful in your management decision in the absence of perfect science advice, which will never get perfect science anyway. And the same thing I think now is happening to ecosystem approach. So instead of taking into account the ecosystem approach, that population or stock within the greater ecosystem, we are now downloading to scientists to give us more and more information on the ecosystem, and managers aren't really taking those considerations in unless it's got to be science-based as opposed to the principle of precaution and ecosystem-based. I think, again, and if we did that, and if we took into account the importance of that population in the entire ecosystem and started to think about what are the needs of the ecosystem as opposed to what are the needs of the fishing activity, what level of F or fishing mortality could result in less depletion of the stock, and we thought more about what aspects of that population are needed for the nature first, then we would start to maybe do a better job. I think that does happen in CAMLAR, for example. CAMLAR is the RFMO in Antarctica. It's not perfect. They learned the hard way with depletion of Antarctic whales, but they do take into consideration how much krill the ecosystem needs in advance of giving any out for fishing. So I think if we thought about things differently within the ecosystem approach, whether it was a stock or a population wouldn't really matter. The paper, to some extent, relies on the fact that science is neutral, and in my experience, science is not often neutral. It can be, but particularly in an RFMO situation when scientists are employees of state governments whose nationals fish. I've been in many scientific council meetings where it's very clear that there is a disagreement on the model, what's in the model, why that model, the variables, and it's very politically driven because there may be one country or another who would like to actually have a different harvest control role or a different quota level. And so I think that the premise that the science, and particularly in fisheries management, is neutral is not always the case. And I don't think we can always blame the models. I don't think models, given that fish are hard to count, I think we do need models. But even when models say that we should reduce total allowable catch by 50%. I'll give an example that happened last year at NAFO. The scientific advice was to reduce the quota for 3M cod. 3M is out on the Flemish Cap off the Grand Banks. One of the first cod stocks to recover in the NAFO regulatory area. Recovered somewhat, was overfished. Then the recommendation was reduce the TAC by 50%. The managers decided, the managers being countries who are contracting parties, decided, you know what, how about just like 20%, right? That'd be a little better, a little easier on us. So that has nothing to do, again, with the model advice or the science advice. It was a management decision that will likely lead to further decline of 3M cod. I think the other piece, so what also for me is missing a little bit is how do we reconcile our commitments to protect biodiversity with our sustainable use of the marine environment. And I think sometimes we forget, for example, that Canada, among other countries, is a signatory to the Convention on Biological Diversity. We have commitments there. We forget them. I've been waiting in Canada. We know that Aichi Target 11, which is to protect 10% of our coastal marine biodiversity by 2020, is a government priority right now. A lot of NGOs push it to be a government priority, but the government's spending a lot of time trying to get 10% of its ocean by 2020. That's great. But there's also a Target 6, which is about rebuilding fish stocks or fish populations. And I keep asking who's tracking Target 6. So there's an example of where a political decision to accept one target that the country has agreed on, but not another, even though the country has agreed on it, make choices around biodiversity protection and how we might make these management decisions. So I think that's another context, I think, in terms of prioritization. I guess, I think scientists and science advice, particularly when fisheries, is not necessarily about biodiversity outcomes, but I think we're all complicit in biodiversity decline. So whether or not it's a stock or population, I think Laurenne mentioned this too, but we are all complicit, scientists, managers, resource users, the public, completely complicit, and we haven't had a collective decision to change this. And our behavior around climate change in Canada is case in point. None of us have probably radically changed our lifestyles, despite all the scientific advice, whether it's precise or accurate, that climate change is happening. I would say that the start would be to stop talking about stocks and start talking about populations more prevalently, and I think that is done in the academic literature, maybe less so in the state management discussion, not necessarily literature. And I think there's some opportunities actually right now. I always win an opportunity so people can feel like they can do something. So this morning I spent some time looking over Bill C-68, which is our Fisheries Act, new potential Fisheries Act. It's a pretty good Fisheries Act, much better than we've had in the past. But when you still dig into it, it's into the Bill C-68 and the case law around the former Fisheries Act prior to 2012. It was very hard to win a court case on fish habitat destruction unless that fish in question was part of a fishery. So I think there's more we need to do. So you could win a case because a fish was part of a fishery. If that fish was not part of a fishery, it was pretty hard to prove that you really needed that habitat, even under in case law. So if you need something to do in the next couple of weeks, you should talk to your MP about making sure that our new act in Canada actually starts to move us away from just a stock perspective into more fish as population, fish as part of ecosystems, and fish that need habitat regardless of whether or not they're part of the sustainable use category or the conservation category. So I'll end with that.
So I am not going to be able adequately to stand in for Dr. Dean Bavington from Memorial University, whose book, Managed Annihilation, A Natural History of the Collapse of the Cod Fishery in Newfoundland, I think I've just changed the title somewhat, is a landmark study very much in the spirit of and sympathetic to, and indeed influential on Dr. Telesca's work. But I do want to make a few comments about language as a historian of science, as a historian of philosophy. Just a comment and observation that is perhaps germane also to the substance of the
critical and constructively critical comments of my colleagues on this panel today. The 17th century, the 16th, 17th century to which Dr. Telesca returns us in her paper is famous for being the period in which science identified itself as dissociating itself with a kind of attention to language that had characterized the study of nature prior to those periods. And again, I'm using broad brushstrokes, but language as a kind of distracting intermediary that confused the inquirer's clear grasp of nature. In that context, words and views of language were privileged that saw language and words as mirrors of human thinking and human thinking as mirrors of nature. This representational view of language, language as what represents what is our thinking, and our thinking is what represents ever more truly what is in nature. This representational view of language was abandoned, of course, in fields very quickly, in philosophy and linguistics, any humanities field in the modern period that trades on an analysis of language. And it is sobering, however, to remember or to consider that science, by and large, has maintained the early modern assumption about language. That is to say, at least in this sense, that language is representational primarily. Words and their histories, their archaeologies, as traces and containers of what Williams called social and historical processes, are largely irrelevant. This consideration of language is largely irrelevant to the practice and conceptual foundation of science. Words, in that sense, simply refer within science. And their meanings, their conceptual histories, their indicators and reflectors and echoes of networks of socially negotiated uses that themselves reflect complex aspects of culture and socio-political economic relations between language users. This, although perhaps interesting, is not relevant, in fact, to science. Now, is it intentional, I want to ask Dr. Telesca, that is it accidental or is it intentional that her work on the concept stock takes us back explicitly to the early modern period, the same period in which both this understanding of language is rooted in contemporary science, but also which is obviously, as she's bringing out, is the origin of the key concepts relevant here to her, of stock, of quantified risk, of fact, of management, of number as the trusted currency of thought. So that's a question. Is it an accident that her history begins in the same period as this beginning of attitude towards language? I suspect it isn't, and let me just wrap up because we are running short, so I'll cut my comments. I think the challenges of Dr. Telesca's whole approach, let alone the specific details of her argument, which have been ably considered and critically analyzed by my colleagues on this panel, the challenges for science, particularly management science, are legion that she is posing that world, particularly in the conservation bodies that she studies as an anthropologist, such as ICAT, the International Commission on Conservation? The International Conspiracy to Catch All the Tunas, the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna. So your call to pay attention to language and to its archaeologies that are buried deep beneath them, I think, is not the least of the challenges to the scientific community that you're posing. And I think partly because at root is also a fundamental question about the nature of language itself. Thank you.
Thank you all for your comments. I'll start from the top down. So I am trained as an anthropologist in international law working in an environmental space. And so I quite literally, I don't read fisheries economics. And so, it's not because I don't want to. It's more the fact that it's physically impossible to cover all bases. Nonetheless, the natural capital material has worked its way up, and it's certainly much larger than fisheries economics. Absolutely, it's not in here. In many ways, in speaking with Ian prior to this, this paper could probably be a whole book, and it's really, in many ways, just a window to try to open up some space and discussion. The question of, so on the citational quibbles over the paper is, in many ways also a basic function of, this is an environment and society journal read by anthropologists and sociologists, and they're not reading this material either. The correlation and causation, again, I don't, I'm coming from a space of trying to understand how an institution such as the one I've ethnographically studied, the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas, reproduces itself. And I'm trying to come from a space of understanding how is it that we've gotten to this place with pretty sophisticated modes and methods of trying to understand what's going on in the ocean. And from what I can tell, from what I've seen, is trying to understand how language actually is a window in which to understand the commonsensical and the basic categories of understanding that function and are mobilized inside these kinds of institutions. So, to say it's correlation versus causation, it's not so much a fish stock that language causes anything. It's more, for me, a larger condition of a social problem that's revealed through language. Is it Anglocentric? Perhaps. I come from a space, I think it's also equally important, not in the paper, is the recognition that this language starts to rev up in the 1920s, 1930s, certainly by the 1950s. And it's not by coincidence in the 1950s. This is after World War II. Europe is ultimately decimated, and the US controlled about 1/3 of the global economy and started to advance this concept. And in many ways, again, I think that, obviously the translation issue across languages, from stock has its origins in many ways in the power of the US in the immediate aftermath of World War II. And this is where some of this language comes from. The question, I think the other place that I also think maybe, hopefully this isn't an effort to speak past one another, but I'm also coming very much from a place of, I teach a class right now called the Human-Animal Relationship, very influenced by work by Raymond Williams, and Donna Haraway, the feminist philosopher, and in many ways part of the project that I find myself invested in is having people see more clearly that the society in which we've currently organized is based on the present premise that people are the great exceptional being on this planet. And in many ways, given the planetary crisis that we're now facing, this kind of thinking needs to come undone. And because of that, for me, stock is just one way to get at this larger dynamic. right? So even to think of fisheries management in some ways as, you know, the conceit in some ways that that managers can actually, you know, control and manipulate a population of fish is itself, in many ways, makes me feel deeply uncomfortable. So the second point, absolutely, you know, the precautionary approach is, this is a legal principle that has been adopted in, so this is why the precautionary approach is written into forms of international law, and it's basically being cast off to the scientists and to ask them to see whether or not the precautionary approach is working. And in that, that fuzzy interface, I think, you know, in many ways, you know, also needs to be deeply analyzed. So what do we call it? You know, I think, you know, maybe some of the questions raise the issue. So if we stop, you know, so is it just replacing stock with another word, and is using populations rather than stock the answer? And the argument that I try to make in here is that that doesn't satisfy me, right? So we know that populations, you know, if you take seriously work by Foucault, and if we know that populations are based on racialized kinds of thinking, speciesist kinds of thinking, then population doesn't adequately do it. And in my view, what needs to change in the language is treating it instead, these are living beings, right? These aren't just populations, right? And they're certainly not just food. You know, I think also another motivation to try to understand, and maybe this, I could have been a bit clearer in the talk. So part of what I'm also trying to understand is that in the regulatory spaces, I know, although in name, right, it's the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas, this is in effect a trade organization. Make no mistake about it. And part of what I feel my effort is in trying to figure, so where are we in the development of extractive forms of capitalism, and other theorists that are trying to understand what's going on in these developments, I think have convincingly written about that you start to see a really interesting shift start to happen in the 1950s, again in the 1970s, and post-1970s is the way in which the new mode of capitalism is in effect being able to figure out how to quantify risk. And that's why, to me, the modelers that are working in an institution like ICAT are not too distant from the modelers that are working on Wall Street. Lastly, Ian, to your question, you know, I absolutely, it's not accidental. This is part of the larger legacy that, you know, so stock in many ways to me is a legacy that we've inherited, that now it needs to be questioned. And I, you know, I think in many ways this is, you know, we see this happening in domains well beyond marine conservation, right? So when people come up to me and they say, oh, you know, so what should I eat? I don't know what to eat. You know, all the stocks are overfished, what do I eat? And that to me in itself is a problem, because you see the extent to which people position themselves as consumers before they position themselves as a citizen. And so, so in many ways, it's part, like a stock or a consumerism, this is part of the larger concern of what happens when this kind of economic and social ordering starts literally to infect the way we speak. So I'll end there.
Thank you. So as we mentioned, we'll open it to the floor for questions. Yes,
Question and a comment. I work in the world between indigenous knowledge systems and Western knowledge systems. And whether we're talking in Lima, or we try to translate it. And as soon as we translate it, the people who are working in that world say, you can't, you change it by translating. Because we apply our language. and the connotations that go with that, with the choice of words we use to translate, puts it more into our knowledge system, and it changes it a lot. And what you've done, which we don't do very often, is look, we're always looking at indigenous knowledge systems and shining a light on those to see how accurate they are, how good they are, how reliable they are. But we never shine a light on our own knowledge system. And I hear the defensiveness in your presentation. We tend to, like any religious doctrine, we tend to not like criticisms of our knowledge systems. And we try to find ways of picking apart anybody who does criticize it. But we need to do that more because we've made a lot of mistakes. In the early 90s, I was participating in workshops in DFO to try to find out how we got to where we are today. And it's our knowledge systems that have failed us. And the use of the word stock, I've sat in boardrooms of large corporations, whether they're in Europe or here, they talk about their stocks. So they'll make decisions about their access to how much they own of that resource for a 1% return on investment for the shareholders, which will outdo any decision we make in government about how to manage our fishery. And we have to understand that the way we talk about our resources, the way we talk about the science to understand those resources is very important. Thanks.
Yeah, if I could just like very briefly follow up, I mean, absolutely, because for me, it's about the recognition of language as a mode of relating to another being.
Yeah.
And if stock is a designation for the dominant mode of relation, it shows where we are as a society in terms of how we're relating to the world around us.
I'm just going to move the mic to the center of the room so that the Facebook audience can hear the. There's a little graph here showing me how well it's picking up the question, so I'm going to do that, and I'm hoping that will help.
Thank you. So thanks again for your talk today. I have two questions. So the first one is, so I understand through your thesis and your argument that language is a mirror of our behavior, culture, or values. Do you think we can use language to change those? And my second question is, I imagine you've been talking to a lot of natural scientists and managers and people from government through your case study, and I'm just wondering, have you spoken to them about this research, and do you think they are ready to reflect on the use of language and how language is a mirror of our behavior and social values?
So, absolutely. I mean, on the one hand, I think part of the challenge, and the comment raised it before, which is to say that because this language is now adopted in the legal system, that it's very difficult to just go and change the language, right? So even though in principle my initial response is yes, absolutely. Imagine how transformative it would be if in a meeting, if you were in a stock assessment, and people started saying a living beings assessment, it would be transformational. But yet it's really difficult because we already have this machinery in place, legalized, that treats this non-human animal being in this way. And so that's why it's not just a matter of just swapping one word for another, right? Because it's representative of a larger system of power that exemplifies how we've organized our society. Have I spoken to other people? You know, I don't think I will offend him if I say this, but and it's not an offense at all. Actually, I think it's quite meaningful. So, you know, I live in New York, and I did my graduate work at NYU, and last fall, Dan Pauly came and was a visiting professor there. And he read this paper. I gave it to him before it was in print. And his response was fascinating, actually, and it really, in many ways, shows how flexible a thinker he is in the way that he, in some of his correspondence, has stopped using the language of stop. So, you know, and I think though he's still he's still a little bit wedded to the population. So I have to talk to him again a little more about that. But you know, again, but I think that there's a recognition that we can intuit the stock as asset as problematic, but I think we equally need to look at why stock as population is also problematic. Right? Because again, if it reduces the complexity of a living being, you're not seeing any kind of variability in these creatures. Right? So for me, I mean, hopefully you all have seen the new Blue Planet series, and you sort of see just these remarkable creatures, you know, just like living in the world, and that for me is what I would love to capture, right? Not this sort of like aggregate population for export.
Thanks for your comments, Dr. Telesca, and the comments from the panel too. It struck me that some of what's getting lost in translation between the panelists and your talk has to do, because what's implicit in what you're doing in the paper, you're foregrounding certain impoverishments in the normative frames at work, but the impoverishment of the normative frame isn't put, strongly and forcefully, explicitly front and center. You're right. Here's the way to do it, because I teach ethics here at Dal. In human bioethics, you've got two distinct levels of normative discourse. One is population, and one is individual. So in biomedical ethics, most of the discourse in normativity is around individuals, and then you do have public health ethics, and then some other stuff, but then that rounds it up to the population. Those ontologies are not consistent, and they never will be. And so in human bioethics, there's been a recognition as well as a struggle with how to deal with those, because both of those involve explicit choices, and there needs to be an acknowledged explicit choice of how to actually balance those consistencies while recognizing there's no meta perspective that will tell you what's the right way to do it. Now, the way in which animal stuff gets impoverished in normativity is it's often in the population, very rarely in the individual, and that's a clear way of actually quantifying the impoverishment of the normative discourse. Also, the instrumentalizing in conservation biology of the animals we're talking about deals with hypothetical imperatives. Ethics deals primarily with categorical imperatives. And so you have to, that's another way to foreground the normative impoverishment within conservation sciences. And then you mentioned human exceptionalism coming out of Haraway. That's yet another way to actually talk about normative impoverishment. We are one species of animal on the planet. We're the last in our genus. We're a member of the great ape family. It's very odd that our moral frameworks are always cooking the books in our favor, and it's a part of the self-interested quality of a number of normative frameworks. But that's what actually calls their objective status into question, because of course, admitting that an ethics is partial and self-interested is a way of admitting that it's not an ethics at all. Right. And so you might want to. I mean, those are a number of ways to foreground clear normative impoverishments in conservation discourse, because it is a very confused normative space. Those of us that work in ethics, where do you start? But I think making it more explicit might help with what's getting lost in translation.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Hi, thank you for your talk. So you spent a lot of time thinking about the way that we tell stories about the object, the fish, that is defined numerically and identified in these ways that you've talked about. I think that your point would be much strengthened by an analysis of the question of what we do with that object, which we've gestured towards the history of 1950s fishery international negotiations and the idea of maximum sustainable yield that comes out of those negotiations. And there's a fabulous history about exactly that, in which the historian shows that the negotiations that went into the Rome Treaty of 1955 are largely influenced by the U.S. State Department and the use of fish as geopolitical tools to demarcate where certain nations need to go in the sea. So I just offer that to you as a way of sort of strengthening and boosting what you're saying about the importance of attending to language. And I can give you this if you want, but I just feel like you've got such a rich focus on the way that we think about the thing, stock, but then this question of how we talk about sustainability and how we talk about yield that was brought in the comments might be benefited by
No, it's honestly, it's fascinating that you mentioned that. So, so this past October, I went over to, I don't know if you know, work by Sidney Hope. He's a 91-year-old fisheries scientist. Yeah, so I went over to interview him because he was part of that 1955 Rome conference. And I am dying, I'm dying to write this paper, which is sort of looking at this moment in the 1950s, which I think is actually really critical if we, so in other discussions as people are talking about the great acceleration of the Anthropocene, there's a really interesting discussion how maximum sustainable yield in this period gets institutionalized, legalized, part of UNCLOS by 1958. And part of what's fascinating about this story is that, and it's actually in here, right, which is to say that, in this quote, which is to say that, that a lot of people will say, oh, it's capitalism. And for me, it's only part of the story, that you also need to attend to questions of global empire, especially when it comes to the ocean. Right, so the famous line, whoever controls the ocean is the empire of the day. And the recognition here is like, so looking how not just forms of capitalism, but the US imperial ambitions in the 1950s used this language and mobilized science in order to weed out the developing coastal states and Japan, because they didn't have the tradition or the bureaucratic know-how to use the science to say whether or not there should be a pullback on the harvest.
Yeah, and in those moments there was debate about whether or not we ought to go with the idea of maximum sustainability.
Right.
There were other options.
Right.
And so it's interesting to think about
Right.
what of those ones would be the other options.
Right, and Sydney's very against MSY.
Yeah.
So, and so I spent a couple days with him to better understand that, because I'm obviously not a fisheries scientist. So, and to try to understand the nuance of how these calculations work.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, just thanks very much for the talk. I really, I would caution about getting, I don't want to get too much mixed up with stocks and populations. I think there's a rich diversity of language, and Susanna refers to biodiversity. Of course, which goes from genes to individuals to groups at a variety of different levels, but stock is definitely an issue. And I think one of the interesting things to think about is how many stock boundaries have changed since they were first established. At least I'm thinking of the Northwest Atlantic in the 1940s and 50s. I don't think any of them have changed. And despite the fact that from a science perspective, we have gained an incredible amount of knowledge about populations, about individual behaviors, about genetics, about migration. And the same thing can be said in Europe as well. I don't know about the US, but boundaries don't change those units because we call them stocks, which have no biological meaning at all, inherently, which is consistent with your thesis, means that they're probably not ever going to change. And Susanna also mentioned about COSIUIC, which we have in Canada, which identifies conservation units that could amalgamate or partition management units, and that created quite a problem when that was trying to be dealt with. So all that to say, I think there's much to be said about your thesis that the word stock, which has no biological meaning, obviously is used as to identify hopefully a homogeneous unit and should be temporally invariant as well. I guess that's a necessity.
Yeah.
And that seems to match our experience with some of these fish populations.
That's fascinating. Yeah, no, I mean, because I think, and I say it's fascinating in part because, so some of the material that I've been reading recently is, again, trying to understand, so where are we now and what have we inherited prior in this moment of an extractive mode of capitalism when the aim is to quantify risk, right? And the key for me is part of what we see is that no matter if the stock goes up or down, someone is making money. right? And that's part of what's really interesting that's happening here. And so, and what I find really interesting about your comment is that we see that, that one of the characteristics to understand this moment is that the time-space compression at a time of globalization is extraordinarily intense, right? And so then to understand how time-space works its way through something like a fish stock is fascinating, right? Because it's trying to spatially locate in ways that, as you say, cannot adequately account for its temporal dimensions. That's interesting.
Yeah, I don't really have a question as such, but I do think this just underlines my belief that there's a lot of harm that can be done by scientists like myself being too reductionist. If we don't, if we're going to have any impact on biodiversity preservation or conservation, if we cannot see that through the lens of human behavior, through the so-called softer scientists of the humanities, we're not going to get very far. So I do believe that the things that frustrate scientists, these are facts. How come policy isn't reflecting facts? It's because it's humans, and we have to be much more savvy about introducing the human element and our biases that we all have, scientists alike, and to really view everything through the lens of all our quirks as humans. Otherwise, we are going to be spinning our wheels.
Thank you for that.
Any other questions? No? Please join me in thanking Dr. Telesca.